late October, we started to see the reports that the Ukrainians were saying, we've severely degraded the Russian logistics in Kupiansk. We have been interdicting their supply lines with drones and artillery. And so there was a real shaping effort that took place in the weeks and months leading up to the decisive counterattack where the Ukrainians actually conducted a mechanized attack. I mean, I don't want to overblow it because it was a relatively small mechanized attack, but they did succeed in getting, the Hartia guys managed to successfully get armored vehicles to help cut off the northern part of the city. And that's actually, I think, very promising and very, very impressive. That shows what a well-provisioned, well-trained, brigade or division can do when they've properly planned everything correctly. And the Russians have overstretched themselves. I mean, there are places where these sort of you get the right combination of all the factors, and it leads to a success. And it was a major success.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're doing something slightly different. We're going to recap the land operations over the last year. And we're very fortunate to have George Barros talking to us once again on Frontline. And George, of course, is the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead on Russia and Ukraine with the Institute for the Study of War. George, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you so much for having me, Philip. Good to see you once again.
Yeah, well, I hope you had a great Christmas. Now, let's start with the year, and we'll go through month by month, if you don't mind. I'm going to say something that I thought was significant, but please feel free to jump on to something that you say is significant. January. January, for me, because this relates to what's going on today, the siege of Kupiansk began. Russian forces launched a massive multi-pronged offensive to seize the Kupiansk Vozlovye rail hub, and Ukrainian forces utilised an active defence, trading space for time while inflicting heavy armour losses against the advancing Russian columns. The Russians were using armour then, they're not now. January, how significant was that, or have you got something that you would rather focus on?
No, I mean, it's interesting because over the course of 2025, we've really seen the maturation of the positional character of this war. And we've seen the maturation of what we call the pointsless front line, which is that the drone kill zone is so aggressive and it's become so aggressive. And the drone operators and the tactics have been honed to the point where both sides are really effectively denying each other's use of mechanized vehicles at scale. There are some countermeasures, and the Ukrainians are actually developing some countermeasures, but it's very interesting. If you look at the battlefield in, late 2024 or even mid 2024, you still would see armored vehicles used in combat occasionally in bits and spurts. And then by the time you get to mid 2025, it's essentially all infantry, small infantry group infiltrations. The mode and method for land warfare had completely changed, especially for offensive maneuver. And I think in January, we're still seeing sort of vestigial armor attacks here and there, but that would later go on to evolve and bring us to the changes that occurred throughout the rest of the year.
So February was a significant month because Ukraine started a decentralized strategy of attacking Russian supply lines, especially across the Donbass, and that seemed to stall the momentum of what was almost described as the Russian winter offensive. Is there anything more significant that you picked up from February?
No, at this time, I really don't think so. I mean, look, it's not been a sexy year to study this war because we've been studying, for the most part, positional warfare. And the story for almost every month of this war really has been Russian forces make sub-tactical marginal gains. Russian forces fail to achieve operational maneuver. Russian forces fail to leverage vehicles at an echelon above a platoon, if that, and they inch forward while taking horrific gains. And, we study the war. There's always a lot of things interesting that are happening, but the Russian summer offensive was rather underwhelming. The winter offensive was rather underwhelming, and we really were just tracking this grinding, attritional, brutal war. What I think. Now that I think about it, and I've had a chance to actually talk it through, some very consequential things in the war did actually happen in February. We had the Russians intensifying their counterattacks to try to repel Ukrainian forces out of Kursk. which of course was consequential. And what accelerated that was not anything that happened on the battleground, but was the political decisions in Washington. We, of course, had perhaps, I think, the cursed February 29 meeting at the White House, where we had that huge blow up between President Donald Trump and President Zelensky. And then consequently, this is a March event, but consequently in March, we turned off intelligence sharing. We cut off the aid temporarily. And the Russians exploited that bad February meeting to accelerate and ultimately kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk in March and April. And so I think that was an important event for us to consider as well.
But yes, and the White House bit did set the conditions. We keep going back to that all of the time. But before the Russians effectively kicked the Ukrainians out of the Kursk region, the Ukrainians managed to carry out another small incursion into the Belgorod area, and there was some talk, and this happened early March, I think, there was some talk of the Ukrainians maybe exploiting that and dislocating the Russians. And we had Ukrainian mechanized brigades again supported by the Russian Volunteer Corps. Now that sounds a bit strange, but it's Russian nationalists or Russian nationals who are part of the Ukrainian military, but fighting against Russia, attacking in, as they did in support of the operations into Kursk. And the ground incursion didn't get a lot of press coverage, but it was fairly significant and had the potential to dislocate what the Russians were thinking about. What were your thoughts?
I think by this point, the incursions were, I think they're insignificant. They're important to study. I think the operational concept, whatever it was supposed to be, didn't achieve its objectives, its goals. I'm not sure, I think some of them could have been diversionary. Perhaps at the tactical level of warfare, they could be used to fix some forces, which in space and time can matter depending on if you really need to deny that force from redeploying to a different particular area at that space and time. I don't have good granularity on that, the open source, but it does seem that Ukraine is always doing these little incursions into Russia, and they've not been decisive for the war. I think Kursk was quite important actually, and I'm actually prepared to defend the Kursk operation. But some of these smaller raids, that sort of thing, I think it's good to fix the forces. I think it's good to constantly do reconnaissance in force and even harassing attacks, because you do want to fix your adversary and not allow the Russians to accumulate all of their forces simply within their desired front lines where they're already doing their frontal attacks within occupied Ukraine. It's good to stretch your adversary throughout the theater and essentially allow them not to be able to get too comfortable in any part of the line.
Yeah. But then, looking at those two and going back to Kursk a little bit, the Ukrainians had been fixed in the east. They hadn't really done much. The Russians had launched a counteroffensive. They were making slow progress, but not anything significant. And everyone was saying that the Ukrainians were, everything was stalemated and all the rest of it. And suddenly this Kursk offensive came out of nowhere. And it was the Ukrainians almost dislocating the Russians and capturing territory, and this was late 24, early 25, but capturing territory that brought the fight into Russia and seemed to throw Putin off his tracks a little bit, because he now had parts of sovereign Russia that had been captured by the Ukrainians, and that was being used as leverage as Donald Trump was settling in at this time from a geopolitical perspective. You said Belgorod wasn't that significant, but Kursk was. Why do you think Kursk was, from your perspective?
Yeah. I think I might have been confused. I was talking about like tiny raids that happened in Belgorod in early 2025, not the Belgorod incursion that happened earlier. No, Kursk. So the Ukrainians conducted the Kursk operation in August 2024, and it lasted throughout the first quarter of 2025. That was very important for a number of reasons, because exactly to your point, it demonstrated that operational maneuver, mechanized maneuver in this war is actually possible. It's just a question of replicating the conditions under which it's possible. Let us remind the listeners that where the zeitgeist and where sort of the public perception space was about the war in Ukraine in summer 2024. The Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023 had failed. The lines had largely been positional. Neither side had been racking up rapid operational gains. The drone tactical kill zone was a thing, which was slowing down advances. And the buzzword that was going around was that this war is stalemated. And we've never agreed with that characterization. It has a positional nature, but it's fundamentally not stalemated. And there's an important nuanced difference between the two, which we can get into if we're interested. But Kursk showed that actually it is possible to achieve operational and tactical surprise. It is actually possible to be able to achieve operational mechanized maneuver and penetrate, 30, 40 kilometers plus in a day or two's time. And then I think that changed the question that changed the debate from how do we terminate a hopelessly stalemated war to, I think, what would be more analytically rigorous. How do we replicate the conditions that existed on the Kursk line such that we can now reintroduce operational maneuver to other parts of the theater? And I think that's been the problem that the military scientists and the real critical thinkers have been grappling with since. So that was very important. It was also important because it shattered a number of myths and legends and taboos about policy vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, this is the first time that we had American strikers and Abrams and things rolling around inside of, no kidding, Russia, killing Russians and killing Russians in Russia. And for the longest time, this is the sort of event that a lot of people have been arguing that, yep, if we do this, this crosses and transgresses all of the Russian lines. It transgresses the provisions in the Russian nuclear doctrine. They're absolutely going to, retaliate or massively escalate vertically, including up to nuclear escalation. And the Ukrainians actually demonstrated that no, you can punch the Russians in the teeth and deterrence works. They'll be mad about it, but they're not going to use a weapon of mass destruction in response because deterrence actually works. And this became the hard counterfactual that allowed us to progress, I think, a lot of the debates beyond we can't do X because that's going to result in us being nuked. Or we can't do Y because that's going to result with the Ukrainians receiving a tactical nuke. Actually, no. And that was very important as well. And frankly, it also set the conditions for the other policy decisions we got later in that year and then into this year. Allowing the Ukrainians to fire ATACMS into Russia, allowing us to share targeting, us being the United States and NATO to share and targeting intelligence information with the Ukrainians to do fire missions in Russia. Those have actually been quite consequential. So for these reasons, Kursk was very important.
Yeah. And the other two things that happened in Kursk from the Russian perspective was it allowed Vladimir Putin to use his conscript troops to try and fight the Ukrainians because they were deployed as border support forces. And of course, then we had the North Korean troops deployed in and attacking against the Ukrainian forces. And this is where the North Korean troops came in direct contact. And the readouts that I've certainly read suggest that the North Korean troops were very good at basic tactics. But when it came to anything any more complex, or when it came to bringing an all-arms element into it, and the North Korean troops were their special forces, they're best trained. They then started to come a little bit unstuck.
Yeah, the North Koreans are sort of a black hole because there's not a lot of credible reporting about them, and it's sort of all over the place. From the Ukrainian service members that I've spoken with in Ukraine, they've described their encounters with fighting or their colleagues' encounters with fighting the North Koreans, and I think they basically said that they shouldn't be underestimated because while they may not be extremely tactically skilled, because the North Koreans haven't ever fought in a real war for since the 1950s essentially, they are fanatically loyal to their leader Kim Jong-un. And they have a level of fervent fanaticism about the profession of arms that just fighting, they have no sense of self-preservation. They're fanatical. They fight to the death. They commit suicide with their own grenades before being killed or captured. And that factor just sort of made them a very dangerous and capable foe on the battlefield. And they had a level of fanaticism that just simply didn't exist even amongst, hardened Russian soldiers, which I found fascinating and interesting. Of course, they only sent a division, so 10,000 people. So that's about a few days. That's like 10 days worth of casualties in the war. It is a relatively small tactical unit, but it was a big deal because it demonstrated that Russia was now capable of dealing with its own war plus this burden that it incurred. They had to go to the North Koreans. Not to mention all the ways that they're bringing in North Korean workers to staff the factories and all that other stuff.
And geopolitically, to the rest of the world, it showed that the Russians were bringing other people in to support their operations directly, not necessarily inside Ukraine at this stage because they were fighting inside Russia. But the next thing that came out, I think, that highlighted was in April, and this is where something that goes on in the background an awful lot that jumps out is the Ukrainian use of their special forces or special operations executive type organizations to tack deep into Russia. And we had a strike on the Bryansk logistic building in March, where Ukrainian special forces conducted a sort of deep land raid, successfully disabling a major railway junction. And that impacted the movement of logistics, and part of that logistics was North Korean supplied ammunition and everything else. We see a build-up of not just manpower coming from North Korea, but ammunition, and particular artillery ammunition, with some other pieces of equipment being seen on the battlefield. What else happened in March?
Yeah, April. Well, April was the 1 year mark after the fall of the Battle of Avdiivka, because Avdiivka had fallen in April 2024. And after seizing Avdiivka, the Russians had been prioritizing seizing Pokrovsk. And it's for those reasons, even though Pokrovsk really came into the news cycle aggressively in November and December of 2025, it had been, at an organizational level, a nearly 2 year campaign to seize Pokrovsk. And by April 2024, or 2025, it had actually already been a 1 year campaign to seize Pokrovsk. And the Russians had only started to get close to it, or rather, not even get close. They'd only closed a part of the distance to start getting close to it. They wouldn't really get within the city's environs until after the summer. Um, but uh, but I think it's important to remember and to put into context that it was several months of this campaigning and warfighting to get towards a former city of 60,000 people, Ukraine's 74th most populous settlement. And it was really a long, protracted campaign for a town. It's almost as if you were to go back and read the history of D-Day, the echelons and the scales are entirely off. So this is sort of an apples and oranges comparison. But it's to say sort of like you do the D-Day operation, and let's suppose they get the bridgehead at the beaches in Normandy. Uh, but then it takes them a year to get to like the town of Bayou or something, or it takes them 16 months to get to Bayou. Bayou, by the way, is substantially smaller than Pokrovsk. So I think Pokrovsk 60,000 people lived in it pre-war. Bayou is something like 12, 13,000 people. So yeah.
And at that stage, Pokrovsk was still useful from a military perspective for the Ukrainians because of its road and rail link, and therefore from a logistic perspective. So there was still, some thought that it had an operational significance to Ukraine holding on to it, which changes as the year goes on. Is that not right?
That's correct. Yeah. So this will be a story for like June, July. But in April, Pokrovsk was still important. Pokrovsk had operational significance at this point because it had the railroad, it had the highways, and the Russian front lines, and the drone operators and artillery threat from tube artillery, rocket artillery was sufficiently far away that the city could be used as a logistics hub, in the manner in which it's been described. To teleport in time a little bit, by the time that we get to July 2025, the battlefield geography, the double envelopment of the Pokrovsk-Mahir complex comes close enough such that the Russians are not yet in the environs of the town, but their drone operators can successfully interdict the railroad and the highways, and the artillery crews can successfully interdict and disrupt the highway and the railroad. At which point, the Ukrainians actually cease using those ground lines of communication, those supply lines, because they're no longer safe. And this is the point at which I would argue the Russians achieved their operational objective. they had effectively neutralized Pokrovsk as a logistics hub. It could no longer be used to facilitate operational logistics as a main supply route to get the forces out to the nearby troops. And this would have been the point at which I think a more intelligent Russian campaign design would have essentially said, okay, comrades, we finished our objective. Pokrovsk as a logistics hub has been effectively neutralized. We have defeated it in detail. We have interdicted it. Now we can focus on dismantling achieving other operational objectives, dismantling other things that the Ukrainians have of operational significance. The Russian command, however, has not broken the penchant for wanting to claim toponyms and seize toponyms for the sake of declaring it, so they can then reinforce a narrative, which is battlefield victory is inevitable. Look at the roster of all of the named locations we've seized. And really from July until December, it was 6 months of relentless fighting to advance a few extra kilometers, a few extra miles to seize the ruins of a town, at the end of the campaign of which the Russian command actually hadn't generated any additional benefit other than simply saying, we seized the town. It does not open up a corridor through which they can unhinge the Ukrainian defense in the rest of southern Ukraine, or southern Donetsk, or the southern part of the front line in Donetsk, rather. This is sort of northern Donetsk, but the southern part of the front line.
But why do you think the Russians didn't recognize that they'd achieved that operational objective, and then do what their tactics say they should do, is just fix, bypass, and go on to their next objective?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I think it's part of Putin's strategy, actually, because the key center of gravity for the war in Ukraine, Putin has identified this explicitly in his speeches, is that it's the international coalition supporting Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have the means to stop Russia by itself. That's never been in question. So this has been a war of an international coalition supporting a beleaguered state under siege against Russia. And Putin understands that as long as he has to fight Ukraine, and if it's a fair fight, meaning it's a fair fight with Ukraine versus Russia by itself, it's a rather unfair fight for Ukraine, then he'll win this war. But if he has to fight the collective economic strength of the NATO alliance and Korea and Japan and the United States, then Russia is doomed, because the collective resources of these states, with the Ukrainian determination, and if we especially remove a lot of the benefits that we've granted Russia, like sanctuaries and protecting their rear from strikes and not sanctioning them as hard as we can, and flirting with the idea of giving them back frozen assets and all this stuff, then the Russians will be okay. So Putin's goal has been actually to convince us to abandon Ukraine, to convince us that actually it's not in our interest to support Ukraine, that Ukraine is corrupt, that or at least corrupt enough that we shouldn't support it against Russia, which, by the way, no, let's not talk about anything about corruption in Russia, or how Ukraine will certainly not be corrupt under Russia, or not be a variety of other things. Convince us that the battlefield victory of Russia is certain, that Russia is the mythical Red Army that will steamroll anything that's in front of it, all of these things. And the Russians need to have tactical victories and names of toponyms of places, and they need to push a line on the map to grow, to be able to claim that at least claim convincingly that Russian battlefield victory is inevitable. If the lines haven't changed in 6 months, that's not a compelling argument and narrative to the lay bystander or to your useful idiot politician, whichever country they might live in. Every country has them. But if the line does move, if they can generate these sort of highly sensationalized battles over operationally significant towns whose significance are lost in the course of a 2-year campaign, but then they continue to impale themselves on it, but then they seize it at the end. A lot of people don't actually have a good grounding in military science or strategy to understand these nuances. And if you look at the year, you'll see at the end of the year, you'll see a roster. Look at all the names of the towns that the Russians seized. You'll get a list of several dozen places, and that will then be used to say, look, the Russian, how many places the Ukrainians took back? Well, they took back Kupiansk, they took back a couple other things, but it's not nearly the same.
But we've captured more, and Putin seems to be fixated on towns at no matter what cost it is to his troops. And we saw that. We saw that with Mariupol. We saw that with Bakhmut. We're seeing that with Pokrovsk. at the moment.
Exactly. And so he's trying to basically convince the West into abandoning Ukraine on voluntarily, essentially, to convince us that that the Ukrainians can't win this, that the Russians are going to win this. And central to that is actually the facade of performance. And so that's why he pushes his army to do these militarily foolish campaigns.
And May, June were significant months because in May we had the battle for the Chasiv Yar Heights. June we had Operation Spider's Web, which was an audacious attack launched by Ukrainian military intelligence. Clearly, it had been in the planning for many, many months. And whenever Donald Trump was turning around in February saying to President Zelensky that he had no cards and lost it with him in the Oval Office, Zelensky was sitting there going, not only do I have some cards, but I've got a full house and I'm going to play it later on this year, but I'm not telling you about it, oh Donald Trump. How audacious do you think that was, and how significant do you think it had, how significant an impact do you think it had on the overall conflict?
So, look, at a tactical operational level of war, I think it was very good because or maybe not very good. It was good because the Tupolev bombers, the strategic bombers, they are used to lob cruise missiles, air-launched cruise missiles at Ukraine, and so taking out those high intensity, low resource assets is a good thing. At the strategic level of war, it was very important because it was again another stake into the heart of one of these vampire myths. I call them vampire myths because you have to like kill it again every 6 months or every 12 months, about the untouchableness of Russia in its deep rear, and the untouchableness of, in particular, of Russia's nuclear triad. We had successfully navigated the debate space away from, well, we can't strike anything in Russia whatsoever, because actually the Ukrainians proved that you could do that with Kursk, and then we started doing attack and strikes in Russia. So that myth had been killed. The next myth was, okay, so maybe some targets are on the menu, but others are not. And then particularly, we wouldn't want the Ukrainians or us enabling strikes against the nuclear triad because of how destabilizing that would be and all that stuff. Because then that, when you start taking out the ability to deliver secondary, return strikes and all that sort of thing, then you start to undermine the mutually assured destruction logic. And so really striking anything that's part of the nuclear triad is off limits. And the Ukrainians,
but on that, with the nuclear triad, and I don't think this came out clearly in the press. Yes, those were the same type of aircraft that are used by the Russians as part of their nuclear forces, but the squadrons that were struck were ones that only carried conventional weapons, because the Russians keep their bombers that are loaded with nuclear bombs and the crews that are dropping them purely on the nuclear tasks, because they keep them at a higher level of readiness. They get more maintenance, they get more money thrown at them, they get more training than those that are being used to just launch the cruise missiles at Ukraine.
I'm sure the crew, you're getting into nuances of the Russian Air Force that I candidly go a little bit beyond my expertise and my granularity of knowledge. But what I do know is that, the Tupolev 95s, they're dual use. They are part of both. The air bases that were struck, I think Engels too, certainly, there might be co-located there. So I'm not sure which ones they struck or which ones were on the runway or what have you. But the point being, people got angry about that, and it was quite good, and actually demonstrated that yes, when the Russians use an airframe, even if it's dual use capable of delivering a nuclear payload, but they've been using it for conventional payloads, it's fair game in a conventional war. And I think that was a very important strike, because it demonstrated that you can actually target things that arguably could be defined as elements of the nuclear triad when they're being used in a conventional way. And it also doesn't result with a catastrophic vertical escalation.
Yeah, and it must have been embarrassing for Donald Trump seeing this hand of cards being played in front of him. And to a degree, it was the start of the Ukrainians wrestling a little bit of the initiative back, where they were taking control of what was happening rather than the Russians dictating what's happening. And that goes on to sort of July and August. And in July, there was a surprise Ukrainian force punching through some clearances that got in minefields around Robotyne, and threatening or posturing to threaten the land bridge into Crimea. And then August we got a sabotage attack into Rostov, the Rostov-on-Don military headquarters, which is the overall headquarters coordinating all of Russian activity into Ukraine. Again, this was indicative of the Ukrainians gaining the initiative from a tactical/operational level, but from a ground level, and putting the Russians slightly on the back foot. Is that what you saw?
Candidly, I might disagree with you here. You're correct. Like at the tactical level, there are places where the Ukrainians have done these counterattacks. Robotin is one of them. They do these raids, that sort of thing. But these are always very fleeting, and they're short missions. They generate important but ephemeral effects, and I don't really think I've seen the Ukrainians seize, with the exception of the Kupiansk operation, which began in Q3 of 2025, which then sort of reached its culmination point in December. With the exception of Kupiansk, I've not really seen a place where the Ukrainians took strong operational initiative, or rather seized the initiative, and that's largely not a fault of the Ukrainians. I mean, we've given them shoestring and bubblegum to work with. So they've done these attacks. They do these little raids. They do these little counterattacks. The line's dynamic, but those individual little events scattered throughout June, July were insufficient to really do anything. They're important, of course, but and they should be able to do more if we supported them better. But these little events, I wouldn't characterize it as like wrestling the initiative in any sort of serious way.
Yeah, no, right to pick me up on that, because I'd agree with you that the Ukrainians are not in a position where they've been able to exploit and make best use of these little attacks that they're putting in. So they are pinprick attacks. I describe them more like a mosquito in the bedroom. Very, very annoying indeed. And you are going to come away with some nasty bites from time to time, but it's not something that is going to have a decisive effect.
Yep, that's right. But like by June, July, this is the point in which the Ukrainians do start to create a salt lick trap in Pokrovsk. It's no longer operationally useful as a supply hub. And they set it up for a pitched battle to really sharpen the tip of their spear so the Russians can hug them and impale themselves and bring themselves deeper onto it, which was, of course, was a 6-month undertaking.
Yeah, and then
and that's where the main effort was.
And with Pokrovsk in September, that was where we really started to debate the closing of the cauldron as it came from a tactical perspective, and the threat to Pokrovsk. That's when we really started to think that it was going to properly fall, but it hasn't yet.
Yeah, we had been talking about the fall of Pokrovsk for a long time, and it was remarkable. I mean, it took the Russians 22 months to advance 20 miles from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. That in and of itself is incredible. The fact that once the Russians actually got into Pokrovsk, and this is with denied main supply routes, very precarious battlefield geometry, effectively, an effective encirclement of the Ukrainian positions. They managed to hold out well over 150 days with the Russians actually in the city limits of the town. I mean, that's pretty incredible. And the Russians, of course, look at the sort of the end after action review. They lost over 5 divisions worth of mechanized equipment, over 500 tanks, over 1,000 armored personnel carriers over the course of 2 years to be able to do this. It was just not a good trade on their behalf. So that was quite, it's been interesting to watch. I wish I had more content to sort of shoehorn into this, because it's supposed to be a year-long retrospective, but it was, lots of activity in very concerted places for not a whole lot of change, but a lot of lives lost and a lot of destruction.
But again, when it comes to Pokrovsk, this is where we saw the first use of the Ukrainians getting a maneuver corps capability to come in, and as the Russians started to, they had a breakthrough to the north of Pokrovsk, which was worrying because they managed to punch in some 10 or 15 kilometers, but then not exploit that. But it required the maneuver of the elements of the Azov Corps up through the positional defensive positions that were there, but then to cut that off very quickly indeed, and then spend the next few months trying to mop it up.
Yeah. So that happened in August. So we call that the Dobropilia salient. So there's a town in Donetsk called Dobropilia. And if you look at the maps, what happened were essentially the Russians successfully identified a weak undermanned spot in the line, the Ukrainian line, and they sent infiltration crews who were very successful at infiltrating, but they went too far too fast. And they got a little lost in the sauce, and they stretched their lines too thin. And so they on the map, they managed to create a fairly impressive looking protrusion, a salient. But then, exactly as you say, Azov was redeployed. They cut them off, largely defeated that protrusion, and it was important because it demonstrated that actually the Ukrainians are capable of some pretty good counterattacks. Actually, it's not inevitable that the Russians just simply gain and never lose. Actually, it was very interesting to study because we saw this sort of big breakthrough, and there were a lot of knee-jerk reactions calling it a tactical breakthrough. And I guess, if you look at the doctrinal textbook definition of a tactical breakthrough, I guess it is a tactical breakthrough. But it wasn't a tactical breakthrough insofar as they actually had units doing tactical task frontal assault, seize terrain. It was actually units doing infiltration missions to try to get to assembly points in a weak part of the line. And that was, once detected, it was mopped up relatively
quickly. I think from my perspective, what it showed was that the Russians were probing away, and they had the ability with the troops that were there, whether it was through their own initiative or something else, to run as far forward as they possibly can, but there'd nothing behind them to be able to reinforce any success that they had. There'd no mass there, and there was no overall plan. So this was almost a breakthrough by accident rather than something that was a deliberately planned operation.
Yes, and here's the key thing, Philip, which is this is the challenge for the military planners now. This Russian tactic of using the small infiltration groups to sort of needle your way forward and consolidate and then keep needling forward slowly, this works when the tactical kill zone denies safe assembly areas at about 25, 30 kilometers, because that's where sort of the artillery and drone threat that's very, very lethal ends. I think the principal challenge right now is how do we extend the Ukrainian tactical kill zone to 50 kilometers? And they'll have to do that with a combination of a variety of systems. Tube artillery is not going to do it. Drones by itself is not going to do it. But there's actually a way to do it, I would argue. The Ukrainians used to do it with HIMARS, but HIMARS are now ineffective due to advancements in Russian electronic warfare jamming. But here's the thing. I think the Ukrainians can actually replicate the effects of neutralizing the infiltrators, because if you ask an infantryman or a team of 3 to 5 infantrymen to infiltrate over the course of several days, 25 kilometers, it's a hard task, but it's doable. You tell an infantryman to infiltrate through a kill zone 50 kilometers, I think that's actually not possible.
Well, especially as they can't be logistically supported and everything else. And this is where there seems to be a slight difference between what the Russians are doing, what the Ukrainians are doing, but then the Ukrainians are defending. The Ukrainians are using small bands of determined men from a commando raid type perspective. And we saw that through October, November with attacks into the Rostov-Donetsk railway sabotage, various Russian supply lines dealt with. But more significantly then, it became very apparent that the traditional linear front line had disappeared. And to try and say this is the forward line of own troops of one side and the forward line of own troops of other side is impossible, because there's little pockets of them that are mixed in amongst each other, and you've almost got 360-degree fighting. And then that really comes to a head whenever we start to examine what was going on in Pokrovsk and then Kupiansk in December of this year. And, Pokrovsk is still holding. Kupiansk is, 2 days later, 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 even more interesting because we had Vladimir Putin turn around and say that it had been taken and completely captured by the Russians. The general that was responsible for it was given a big medal. Putin said he'd take the international press in to see it. And then 2 weeks later, Zelensky is standing there in front of the Kupiansk sign, taking a selfie saying, you haven't got it and we've got 90% of it back. A fascinating period of time.
Yeah. So the December stuff in Kupiansk was a culmination of at least 3 months of campaigning. Because we went back and we looked at the data for all the things that we could collect and gather over Kupiansk, and actually, the Russian sources had been reporting Ukrainian counterattacks of the nature of which we saw the culmination of all throughout December up to that point, including into November. And then in November, and I think even late October, we started to see the reports that the Ukrainians were saying, "Yeah, we've severely degraded the Russian logistics in Kupiansk. We have been interdicting their supply lines with drones and artillery." And so there was a real shaping effort that took place in the weeks and months leading up to the decisive counterattack, where the Ukrainians actually conducted a mechanized attack. I mean, I don't want to overblow it because it was a relatively small mechanized attack, but they did succeed in getting, the Hartia guys managed to successfully get armored vehicles to help cut off the northern part of the city. And that's actually, I think, very promising and very, very impressive. That shows what a well-provisioned, well-trained, brigade or division can do when they've properly planned everything correctly. And the Russians have overstretched themselves. I mean, there are places where these sort of you get the right combination of all the factors, and it leads to a success. And it was a major success. But what I also showed was another thing which is interesting, which is some reflections I made about how we mapped this war from the open source. We used to have a methodology, and by we I mean the open source intelligence, cartography community, where if you saw a Russian ground presence in a particular place and you could geolocate it, that is determined that it certainly happened there, that would become a vertice in your line for where you would draw the front line of own troops for the Russians. The Russians caught on to that, and they started to metagame the methodology for how many folks were making these maps. And so then what they started to do was have Russians deploy forward with flags, and their mission was to actually go to a contested location that the Russians certainly don't control, raise a flag so that our drone can take a picture of you ostentatiously waving a flag at a known landmark. You might get killed or captured. That's inconsequential. But what will happen is this will go on the internet, and then we will put this forward as the putative evidence that the Russians exercise control over large swaths of new terrain, because you have successfully infiltrated, that's what infiltrators do. And so in October, there were a number of infiltrations into Kupiansk. I mean, there were individual Russians that engaged in acts of perfidy. They put on civilian clothing. They got to a particular area deep into Kupiansk. They took off the clothing, threw up a Russian flag, were killed or captured almost immediately, or they crawled through a sewer pipe to basically teleport into the middle of Kupiansk, take a picture with a flag. And then a bunch of people, and ISW did this too. I mean, we didn't have a methodology to deal with this at the time, but we're like, all right, well, there's a Russian there. Clearly, we think it's an assessed infiltration mission, so they don't exercise control. But a lot of folks would sort of, same color red they paint Mariupol over in 2025, that's the same color red they'll paint Kupiansk over, and that's a problem. So what we did in early November is, recognizing this, we started to map infiltration areas separate of the areas where we think the Russians have conducted frontal attacks into, and separate of the areas where they think they actually exercise control.
And this is where if the Russians had done that, they wouldn't have that strategic effect of embarrassing Vladimir Putin by declaring they'd captured somewhere. So very, very briefly, do you see much of a change in 2026?
The war will likely continue. There's this peace process thing, and everyone's talking about the peace process thing. But look, the Russians have made it very clear that they're not going to favorably look at any sort of agreement that is not a capitulation to Russia. They reject the concept of Ukraine receiving security guarantees. They demand that the Ukrainians cede over large swaths of strategically vital territory that the Russians don't control. and are not likely to cease with at least another 2.5 years, 3 years of war fighting. So I think that's at a little bit of an impasse. Um, the most dangerous course of action is, of course, the United States repeats what it did back in February, March of 24, which is, all right, we're cutting you off, enjoy your war, which would be very bad. Um, it would be very, very, very bad. But this war, I don't see it coming to an end anytime particularly soon, in my humble judgment.
Well, George Barros, kind of thank you for what you and ISW have done in keeping us informed throughout 2025. And unfortunately, you look forward to those same insights through 2026. And from a personal perspective, thank you for your inputs to Times Radio Frontline. And thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Philip. Always a pleasure, and I look forward to the next time.
You've been watching Times Radio Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, if you want more on the war in Ukraine, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for membership to get you exclusive content and allow you to ask questions back to me. And remember, Frontline is also available in podcast form. You can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Times Radio Frontline.